Today I'm going to talk to you about Europe and Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is obviously a part of Europe, has been a part of Europe for many centuries in European history, but it is interesting to understand of which Europe Ukraine has been part of and in which way it has been part of Europe. So let me start with a kind of a definition, my subjective definition. What is Europe? So for me, Europe is a long process and long project of reducing the space for violence and extending the space for freedom. Now, you can question this definition by saying that, look, Europe experienced a lot of violence in its history. Look at the 20th century, which was so bloody and covered by blood and covered by violence and covered by world wars. Or look at the 19th century with its colonialism, with its very harsh and very cruel European imperialism. This is all true, of course, but what makes Europe different, for example, with Russian political project, is that gradually, after all this, paroxysm of violence, Europe tries to learn some lessons. And for me, this key lesson is after each of these horrible cycle of violence, Europe tries to rethink itself and reduce the space for violence. For example, if we take 19th century, the big question of European history is how to reduce violence against communities. Now, European history before 19th century was a history of, monarchies, empires, aristocracy, royal families, etc. And in this history, communities, the grassroots communities, what was called peoples, or nations without states, didn't play really a great role. So a big task of the 19th century was to reduce violence against these communities, to give them much more freedom. And there were two major types of these communities which were struggling for emancipation. The first type is national communities, right? So those nations which did not have states at the early 19th century, for example, and which was struggling for its nationhood and its statehood. And this process started around, early 19th century. One of the peaks of this process was the Spring of Nations, the Spring of People in 1848, but it was extending throughout the 19th century, and the peak of the liberation of nations, so to say, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, was of course the end of the First World War, when several empires collapsed, and the principle which started governing Europe to a certain extent was a principle of self-determination of nations. The second part of the community which was struggling for the emancipation in European history in the 19th century was social and economic communities. The poverty which was existing primarily in the in the cities, working class, in what was called proletariat. So it's a big social and economic issue related to the extension and to the development of socialism. And by the way, 1848 was also a very important year for this type of emancipation of communities, emancipation of working communities. I mean, of course, the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, to which I am very critical, by the way, but it is very important milestone. And of course, it also had, very interesting history throughout the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. And by the end of the First World War, there is this, wave of revolutions which brought this, to a certain extent, in Russia, for example, these proletarian forces to power, which created, by the way, very horrible consequences for Eastern European history, but that's another story. Now, the 20th century, while the 19th century was a century for Europe of emancipation of communities or reducing the space for violence against communities, the second half of the 20th century was marked by the idea of emancipation of individuals. So the reducing the space for violence against individuals. It started already in early 20th century, this rise of individualism, the rise of aesthetic self-expression, which was expressed, for example, in literary or artistic avant-garde. And basically it formed itself as a kind of a doctrine or as a kind of social reality after the Second World War, when the huge question was asked, a question about human rights. Why this question was asked about human rights, about about the rights of an individual, even against its own states? Because before the Second World War, we can say that the rights of men and women were secured primarily as the rights of citizens. Now, the question is that sometimes, of course, community and its citizens have to, fight for their freedom and have to have their rights and freedoms protected. But what happens when their states or these communities commit violence against the citizens themselves? That was a big question, of course, of the Holocaust, and in Ukrainian case of the Holodomor, and of many other acts of massive violence, when it seemed that communities it was not basically violence of bureaucratic states against citizens. It was not violence of a monarch against its subject. It was violence of communities. For example, in the Holocaust example of the so-called Aryan, racist community against another community, against Jews, Slavs, Roma, etc. In the case of Holodomor, it was a violence, as it was presented, a violence of the proletariat against the peasants. This is how it was presented by the Soviet propaganda, by the way. So the second half of the 20th century is a epoch when this violence is being reduced against individuals, including when the individuals suffer from violence by their communities. And all this process created this the ecosystem of what we know as the epoch of human rights, or revolution of human rights in European and global history. Of course, the idea that human rights should have global framework was also an important idea of the second half of the 20th century. Now, when you ask me what is the 21st century, I would tell you that 21st century is the era of reducing violence against nature, against the environment. So 21st century is leading us to think that moral subject is not only a human being, but also nature. Nature is also a moral subject. Nature is also something that we can and should be taking care of, something that we feel and exercise our responsibility, right? So in a way, 21st century is reducing the space for violence even further and extending the space of dignity, I would say, from humans to nature as well. Now, where Ukraine is in this whole process, it is very interesting, because at a certain moment you understand that Ukrainian history was not really very exotic when you look at the European history. So many issues, many trends in the Ukrainian history, primarily its intellectual history, how its writers, artists, historians were reflecting upon what is going on, was in a way reflecting what was happening in Europe. For example, if we take this issue of emancipation of communities, well, Ukrainian literature at the early 19th century was going along the same way as many European literatures. For example, the issue of a national rebirth or national palingenesis, how it was called at that time, national regeneration, raising from the dead. This is national raising from the dead. This was one of the most important metaphors of the time, let's say of 1820s and 30s. It was born in France, then it came to such countries as Poland, for example. This idea of Poland raising from the dead. It came, of course, to Italy with this idea of Risorgimento. It was present also in Britain, in Scotland, with such people as Thomas Carlyle, or before him as Walter Scott, for example. And of course, it was also present in Ukraine. Let's say in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, it was very well present in Ukrainian literature by such poets as Taras Shevchenko, such writers as Marko Ovchok, a female writer who wrote under the masculine pseudo, but such historians as Mykola Kostomarov, etc. There is one important point where Ukrainian lands were kind of historically lagging behind European lands. And I'm not talking only about Ukrainian lands. Of course, I'm talking about the Russian Empire as a whole. The reality of serfdom. So peasants in Russian Empire until 1861 were actually almost slaves. Or I would say, well, probably not slaves, but at least they were living in kind of a feudal reality when they had very little freedom or no freedom at all. So it is important how, this idea of liberation of communities was so much present for Ukrainians, so much present for other people in the Russian Empire, both as a national emancipation and social and economic emancipation, because the issue of liberation of peasants from serfdom was kind of the big abolitionist trend in the Ukrainian literature. But we are talking about it, in the middle of Europe. So this abolitionism was an issue of European lands, of European reality. And the year of 1848, which is called the Spring of People, the Spring of Nations, could also have happened in Ukraine. But the Russian Empire was very careful and, very cruel to the very idea that it might happen. Therefore, one of the key, centers of this possible manifestation, probably not revolt, not political revolt, but a big political manifestation that could have happened in Ukraine. This was a so-called Saint Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, and I mentioned Shevchenko, we can mention Kulish, we can mention Kostomarov, we can mention Markovich, many other Ukrainian intelligence of the time. So it was destroyed just a year before, in 1847. And for example, Shevchenko was sent to exile, and many other actors of this very interesting community were arrested. So in a way, I would say that, this attempt of the Spring of Peoples, while it was so much powerful all over Europe, it was amputated in Ukraine because of the specific reality of Ukrainian lands being a part of the Russian Empire. If we come to the issue when after the First World War, the idea of self-determination of nations, etc. Well, Ukrainians did have their independence. They could have become another nation state in the Eastern and Central Europe. We tend to forget about it. So Ukrainians did have their independence from 1917 until 1921, and probably if Bolsheviks didn't rebuilt their empire, the Russian Empire, under the name of the Soviet Union, probably we could have an independent Ukrainian state as an independent Poland, or independent Czechoslovakia, or independent Baltic states, or independent Balkan states, well, at least until the Second World War. But it didn't happen, and Ukrainians lost its independence, kind of this expansion, imperial expansion of the Soviet Union, which was basically another reincarnation of Russian Empire, continued. When we are talking about the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, well, this revolution of human rights, of course, it took place in the Western Europe, or in the United States, or in some other countries of the world, but it didn't happen in Soviet Union. So Soviet Union, as a winner in the war, well, basically was much slower in developing this idea that, look, not only communities have freedom and have dignity and have the right to protect themselves against the oppressor, but also individuals within these communities. If communities become authoritarian or totalitarian, they have a right, international right, to protect their freedoms, their rights and freedoms. And what happened in the Soviet Union in the 70s, after the Helsinki process, when this idea of human rights, inviolability of borders, national sovereignty, but also, human rights, was developing across the world, and Soviet Union also signed these Helsinki agreements. What happened across the Soviet Union, and including in Ukraine, was this development of Helsinki human rights groups. Now, why Helsinki movement, Helsinki human rights groups was so important? The movement of dissidents around the Soviet Union, but especially in Ukraine. Because basically it was an idea that, look, we have to protect human rights. And Ukrainian patriotic or national movement from the 70s and 80s has become a liberal movement, a movement of people who were fighting both for national liberation and for liberation of individuals and human beings. So it was kind of a mixture of patriotic and liberal movement, and in a way it was very much the liberal element of it was, and human rights element of it was very, very important. Now, if we look at Ukrainian independence in 1991, we can see that both these, European projects, the liberation of communities and the liberation of individuals, well, they were not accomplished in Ukraine. They were not accomplished due to objective reasons, because Ukraine was still part of the empire in the 19th century and continued to be a part of the empire in the 20th century. So it was not strong enough to get its independence. Its opponent or enemy, the imperial enemy about which I talked a few episodes earlier, was strong enough and cruel enough to contain or to destroy these attempts of Ukrainians for liberation of communities and liberation of individuals. The 21st century, which is a century of environment, which is a century of ecology, which is a century of reducing the space for violence against nature, is also very important for Ukrainians. And Ukrainians, again, are not still, not accomplishing, not going along this direction fully, even though Ukraine was a land which suffered from one of the biggest environmental disasters in the world, the Chernobyl disaster. So in a way, Ukraine is a very important, very interesting example how this trauma, this violence against nature and of course against ourselves is also a big trauma and big thing to rethink. And by the way, Ukrainians are trying to rethink what has happened and also learn the lessons. So I hope that 21st century for Ukraine as well will be not only the century when Ukraine will catching up with this process of nation building, community, the emancipation of communities, human rights fight for human rights, but also the fight for the rights of nature. This was Short Talk by Ukraine World. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld.org, Ukrainian philosopher and writer. I hope you stay with us.